if the detention is not appropriate, we will demand his immediate return.
Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor haven't been charged, much less had a trial. But today's senior Chinese government official says the Canadians being held in Beijing broke the law.
Syria was lost long ago. And besides that, I don't know, we're talking about sand and death.
There continue to be Daesh elements that either want to reemerge or have existed from before, and we're helping identify where those are and help the Iraqis deal with them.
The purpose of the delegation is to engage with Chinese officials, to meet with business leaders, to meet with representatives of NGOs and others, to talk about the important bilateral relationship between Canada and China.
That was Alberta Conservative MP Michael Cooper. He's part of a bipartisan parliamentary delegation that's heading to China this weekend, despite strained relations between the two countries, as two Canadians remain in detention in China. Late last week, the State Department issued a travel warning urging Americans to exercise increased caution in China. And in a study released late last month by the Council on Foreign Relations, there is a note about potential conflict in the South China Sea as one of the geopolitical hotspots of 2019. Could that spell more trouble for Canada, and what are the other hotspots we should be keeping an eye on? Joining me now from Washington is Paul Stairs, Senior Fellow for Conflict Prevention and the Director at the Center for Preventative Action at the Council on Foreign Relations. Paul, what do you think of this group of Canadian lawmakers who are traveling to China? Is it a good idea, when tensions are so high between Canada and China right now, to go over there and try to mend fences, or would it be better to send a signal and refuse to go on this trip?
No, I think it's very important to engage the Chinese now to show that this kind of behavior, this sort of tit-for-tat response, is unacceptable, and it has to be dealt with in the appropriate manner. And so I think it's important that this delegation goes ahead, and it's important, moreover, that the United States stands firmly behind Canada, and the Europeans do too.
I know the United States has put out a travel risk advisory for American citizens going to China, warning them there can be arrests. In Canada, there's been pressure on the Canadian government to maybe up the warning that exists here. Do you think it's safe for North Americans to go to China right now?
I think, yes, it's basically safe. They have to exhibit some caution and avoid any kind of contentious or controversial behavior when they're in China, not go looking for trouble, but otherwise they should be perfectly safe.
China is one of the big hotspots that you identified. What makes it so dominant as an area and a country that we really need to be looking at in 2019?
Well, it's obviously one of the biggest economic powers in the world and one of the largest military powers in the world. And its role and influence in world affairs is only going to increase in the 21st century. And we have to find a way to work with China to deal with areas of conflict, but also work together to deal with many common challenges, whether it's climate change, global trade, proliferation. There are no end of major global challenges that will require cooperation with China.
The Middle East, of course, is always a challenge, no matter what administration's in power. But with the Trump administration and this sort of unpredictability in the recent announcement that Donald Trump is going to pull troops out of Syria, where do you see the Middle East going this year?
Well, as many people acknowledged in our recent survey, there's broad concern that the situation is going to deteriorate in the coming 12 months. There are many potential flashpoints from Syria to Yemen, rising tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And we have this recent announcement by President Trump that he wants to pull out U.S. forces from Syria. The problem is that when we pull out of places, others step in, and that can cause all kinds of problems, which then drag us back in at a later date at greater costs. So there's a lot of concern about what President Trump's decision may presage for the region, and whether actually this is a good move by the United States.
One of the countries that have stepped into the void, of course, is Russia, increasing influence in certainly Syria and the surrounding area. It's also a country that you talk about in your hotspot survey. Where do you see Vladimir Putin's Russia going in 2019?
Well, they're clearly worried about their economic situation and failing domestic support for the Putin regime at home. And I think there's broad concern that he may put pressure on Ukraine to distract public opinion at home. And we're seeing this already with the recent flare-up in tensions with Ukraine close to Crimea. And I think we can see maybe as we move closer to the Ukrainian elections in March that we might see some heightened sort of cyber influence operations inside Ukraine, some potential meddling in the election that we've seen elsewhere by Russia, and that could be a real source of tensions between the West and Russia.
If you had to pick sort of the single biggest hotspot that Canadians and Americans should keep an eye on in this coming year, what would it be?
The place that most concerns me is either a sort of return to heightened tensions on the Korean Peninsula. If the so-called nuclear deal with North Korea starts to unravel, then we could see tensions ratcheting up in North Korea again this year. The other, I think, sleeper issue is Taiwan. And as we moved into election season there and for 2021, Taiwan could be a much more contentious issue than it has been in the recent past. And that could be a real challenge to both the United States and Canada.
Paul Steres, thank you so much for your time today.
You're very welcome.